Alan and Brian grew up in a huge, luxurious mansion. They were fortunate to be born into incredible wealth. But sadly, their rivalry since childhood has had a negative impact on their lives. Alan, the older one, had a burning desire that would not go away. He always thought that he should be the heir to the family wealth. Even when he was very young, he worked hard to get to the top of everything. He was always on the go, as shown in his sharp, well-tailored clothes and expensive watches. He was always trying to show their father, Richard, that he was worthy of their love. Richard was the head of the family. Brian, the younger one, was naturally less stressed and more relaxed. He liked to try new things and enjoy the easy things in life, but he didn't like being compared to his bigger brother all the time. Their father seemed to love Alan more than him. Brian couldn't help but feel like Alan's drive made him less important. There was a lot of tension between the brothers. It was always just below the surface, ready to boil over into a heated fight. One day, Brian said, "I don't understand why you're so set on being the golden child." His voice was a mix of anger and love. Alan, who was sitting at a shiny wooden desk, rolled his eyes. "Brian, I'm not stuck. I'm determined. Dad's business, this house, and everything else is mine by birth. I'm going to carry on our family tradition." Brian looked at his brother with a face that showed both sadness and anger. "Does that mean I don't own anything? Will I always be the other kid because of that?" Their angry argument ended just as quickly as it started. Neither brother was ready to give in, so they both kept quiet to heal. Generations had inherited the family's wealth. Richard, their father, had worked hard all of his life to build a successful business empire so that his boys could live a great life. Their mom, Margaret, had always tried to keep the peace between the two boys, whose differences were getting worse. The family home, which was a work of art in architecture, showed how much money they had made. It had large gardens with bright flowers that were carefully cared for, beautiful art collections on the wall, and a lot of expensive cars in the garage. Still, the brothers thought that everything they had was theirs, because their father had worked so hard to build the business. They often took it for granted. One night, when the family sat down to dinner in the fancy dining room, everyone felt the stress in the air. Richard, who was sitting at the head of the table, watched his boys with worry and anger. He had worked hard to take care of them, but it looked like his efforts had made them fight more. With a fatherly tone in his voice, Richard said, "I hope you boys know what a blessing it is to be alive. We didn't get this wealth by luck. It comes from generations of suffering, hard work, and commitment." Margaret agreed as she sat down next to her husband. "Your father has given you everything, but he expects you to value it and each other." Alan quickly replied, "Of course, Mom. We appreciate everything you and Dad have done for us." He said this with a hint of sarcasm, but Brian kept quiet and his face showed that he felt a little guilty. He knew that he and his brother were both to blame for what's going on. Richard decided one day that he had had enough of his boys' spoiled and materialistic ways. He saw their fights were causing the family to split up, so he came up with a way to teach them a lesson. He chose to tell everyone that his business had failed and that the family's money was almost gone. As Richard set his sons down in the grand sitting room, they looked shocked and confused. Richard then started to speak. He began, "I've called you here to share some difficult news." His voice was steady, but heavy with the weight of his choices. "My business has taken a terrible turn. We've lost all our money and the family's wealth is almost gone." There was complete silence in the room. All the grandeur that used to be around them seemed to fall apart like a house of cards. "What?" Alan yelled, and his face lost all color. "You can't be serious, Dad." Brian's eyes got bigger, and shock showed on his face. This can't be happening." Richard kept looking at his boys. The seriousness of the situation made him feel weak. "That's right. I lost everything. The business is linked to the house, the cars, and the art. We won't be able to keep living this way." The brothers looked at each other in horror. Their lavish lives were suddenly not possible. Their bank accounts, which used to be full, were now holding pennies. The shock left them speechless and unsure of what would happen next. The big front they had been living under fell apart in front of their eyes. Alan and Brian were at a scary point in their lives as the truth of their father's news started to set in. They made a hasty and emotional choice because they didn't have enough money to keep up their once luxurious habits. They didn't think twice before leaving their parents behind. The house that had been a sign of the family's wealth was now just a shell. The day they left was sad and filled with tears. Margaret begged her boys to change their minds as they stood on the steps of the mansion. With tears in her eyes, "Please, Alan and Brian," she begged, her voice shaking with emotion. "Let's start over together. We can get back together as a family. Money can't come and go, but what means the most is the bond between us." Alan stayed determined, driven by the sense of privilege that had made him want to succeed. "Mom and Dad, you've made up your minds, and so have we. We are going to go our own way." Brian said goodbye in a mumbled way and turned away, determined to make his own way in the world. The brothers said goodbye with sad hearts. Alan moved to a beautiful tropical island where he could enjoy life's joys by being surrounded by the ocean's clear waters. Spending too much was all he did because he enjoyed the good things that being rich still gave him. He loved going to the island's fancy resorts and wild parties. While this was going on, Brian moved to a busy European city with cobblestone streets that were full of history. He went to places with Michelin stars and the hottest nightclubs all the time to live the high life. Even though he wasn't very wealthy, he put on a show of wealth by using the last of his fortune to pay his expensive lifestyle. A wall of silence over the years. The big house that used to be filled with lots of noise was now eerily quiet, its wealth becoming a painful memory of the past. Alan and Brian forged different paths abroad, driven by their pride and their dislike for their family and each other. They were cut off from their parents and couldn't talk to them. Their once bright relationship was now nothing but ashes. Their parents, Richard and Margaret, tried to get them to talk to each other through letters and notes, but no one answered. They were left in a painful state of isolation. The halls, which used to be noisy with the kids' laughter, were now quiet and filled with memories of better times. "I never thought it would come to this," Richard told his wife in a rare moment of weakness. "I thought the desire for family would be bigger than the desire for money." She sighed and said, "We can't give up on them, Richard." Margaret had always been the emotional center of the family. "We need to fix what's been broken and get our kids back." Margaret was tired of the distant relationship that was getting worse every day, so she decided to do something about it. She finally gave up because she couldn't stand how empty their once bustling house felt. She came up with a plan to get her sons back into their lives with Richard's help. She had the idea for a while, a risky plan to get her family back together. The brothers had not heard from her in years. So she called them and told them that her father had died. She carefully chose the words she used in the letter, and she wrote it in a tone of sadness and peace in the hopes that it would bring her boys back to the family they had left behind. Alan and Brian felt terrible about what they had done and went back to the house that had been their safe place. The big entrance with its marble floors and large chandeliers felt just as grand as before, but there was a sad feeling in the air. Needless to say how shocked they were when they saw their father alive and well. But they didn't make a big deal out of it, because deep down they knew why their mother lied about their father's passing. Margaret was happy to see them and welcomed them with open arms. Their faces showed a mix of happiness and sadness. Margaret whispered, "I've missed you both so much." Her eyes were wet with tears that she hadn't shed yet. "Nothing should ever get in the way of us being a family." Brian looked around and felt bad about the years he had wasted. "I can't believe we took all this for granted." Alan nodded, and the mistakes they had made hung heavy in the air. "Brian, you and I were stupid. We should have been thankful for what we had." The family was getting together in the living room. The air was tense. Their dad, Richard, started to tell them the truth. "I wanted you to see the world in a new way and know how important love, family, and values other than money are. That's why I told you my company had shut down." The brothers looked at each other in shock, as the enormity of their father's lie started to hit them. "So that was all a test?" Brian asked in a shaking voice. Richard nodded, and his eyes were filled with both happiness and sadness. "Yes, I wanted to see if you would come back, if you would reevaluate your priorities." He then dropped the bombshell. "I've decided to give my money to family members and good causes. You're not ready to take over my estate. I want you to understand that family and love are more valuable than money." The room went silent in shock. The boys had a hard time understanding how important their father's choice was. What they had known, the life of ease they had taken for granted, was now falling away from them. Richard kept talking, his voice full of feeling, even though tears were in his eyes. "I've never needed sons who were more interested in money than in me. The years of being apart have shown me what your real goals are, and it hurts my heart." Margaret put her hand on Richard's and said in a soft voice, "We didn't want to make a family split up over money, but we needed you to understand that the most valuable things you can pass on is love and the bond between family members." "We're so sorry, Dad and Mom," Brian said with a shaking voice. "We're very sorry for the mistakes we've made." Alan felt the same way, but he didn't say anything because he couldn't find the words to describe how guilty he felt. Alan and Brian were stunned and upset when they learned about their father's shocking choice. The brothers' heads were hurting from their mistakes as they left the house again. They were shocked, felt badly about what they had done, and knew they had missed the chance to be a family. Their parents were left behind as they left the wealth they had known and the family that they had taken for granted. The huge house that had been a sign of wealth was now a reminder of the years and chances they had missed. Brian said to Alan as they left the house and asked, "We've lost it all, haven't we? Because our own ambition and pride made us blind." Alan said, "We've lost more than just money, Brian," with a heavy voice full of sadness. "We've lost love, time, and family." The boys had been mean to each other in the past, but now they both felt sad and guilty and didn't know what the future held for them. The brothers went back to living different lives abroad, each carrying the heavy weight of the decisions they had made in the past. Even though they knew they had hurt their parents, it seemed like their pride and stubbornness would be hard to get over the years. Alan kept living his fancy life, even though not having his family around filled him with a hole that no amount of money could fill. On the tropical island, he was surrounded by wealth, but it was emptier than the grand house he had ever been. With the love and support of his family, his parties and other fun things seemed pointless. At the same time, Brian, who had moved to a busy city in Europe, became even less interested in his family's desire. He lost himself in his high-class friends and never-ending social events. He used the city's distractions to get away from the guilt that was eating at him. He always felt empty because he didn't have his parents and brother in his life. He tried to avoid the pain. Brian couldn't help but hear her talk about family and how important it is while he was at a fancy gala in a huge ballroom one night. It touched him deeply and made him think of the ties he had ignored in the past. On one hand, Alan was sitting by himself on the beach of a faraway island, looking up at the stars. The crashing waves seemed to carry the longings of his family, and he understood how empty his life was without them. Back at the mansion that used to be full of life, Margaret was alone in the huge, echoing rooms. The house was so quiet now that it was hard to forget her sons weren't there, and she felt very lonely. She often walked aimlessly through the empty halls, leaving only her footsteps behind in a house that used to be alive with laughter and family. In every room, Margaret could feel the happy memories of family birthday parties and holidays, which made her feel sad. Sometimes it was dark in the living room. She would look through old picture albums and cry as she thought about the better times. She missed her boys so much and felt like a part of her was leaving. Even though she tried to get in touch with her family through letters and texts, they didn't seem to help. It made her feel bad that they were no longer together, and she wondered what else she could have done to stop it. Richard also thought about the decision he had made. He couldn't help but wonder if he had been too hard on his kids as the years went by. He really missed them and wished for the times when his family was all together, and their laughter filled the whole house. He found comfort in the huge yard, and he would often walk there by himself, remembering his family's laughter and presence. He wondered if he had pushed them away too hard, and if his plan to teach them how important love and family are had been too harsh. But when Richard thought about it, he stuck to his opinion that love should always come before money. When he was aware that his choice had been hard and caused pain and separation, he was adamant in his belief that his boys needed to know how important family bonds were, regardless of money. Richard and Margaret longed for the day when their family would be back together and their home would be full of love and laughter again. The empty grand house was a reminder of the results of their choices. Margaret was determined to get their family back together, so she worked hard to come up with a plan to bring her sons back for good. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to do anything to fix the problems that had split her family in two. She planned for many sleepless nights how to show her sons how much she loved them and how important it was for them to be with her. Margaret's mind was full of thoughts one night as she sat in her favorite garden. She thought about what her kids would really care about and what would teach them how important family is. She was determined, so she wrote a letter from the heart and showed her love, her hunger, and her hope for a better future. Margaret wrote a letter in the dim light of her study. Her hand was shaking with a mix of hope and fear. She wrote from the heart, remembering happy times with her family and the warmth of their laughter. Her wish was for the family to be whole again, for everything to get along, and for everyone to learn what love is really worth. Margaret's plan worked, and Alan and Brian went back home because of the touching message. As soon as they walked through the mansion's grand door, the familiar space seemed different. They were met by their parents, who had put aside their differences because they knew how important family was. Margaret hugged her boys and told them, "I've missed you both so much." She had tears of joy running down her face. "I love you more than anything else in the world." The house that had been so empty before was now filled with love of family. The grand living room used to be very quiet, but now it was filled with laughter and deep talks. The garden, which used to be haunted by their abundance, bloomed with happy sounds and bright colors. During their family meals, they talked about the years they had been apart, the things they had done, how they had grown, and how much they missed each other. It hit the brothers that their love for their parents and each other was greater than any rivalry or money. Starting over, the family became closer than ever. Richard and Margaret chose to benefit not only from their sons, but also people who were in need with their money. They knew that family and love were more important than money. Because of what happened, the brothers understood that they were wrong and tried to make things right. When Richard and Margaret's home was empty, it was hard on them, but they found new meaning in helping others. They set up scholarships for kids who didn't have much and gave money to groups that helped families in need. They learned that money could be used for good, and they wanted their boys to learn the same thing. They were both happy with the easy things in life, laughing with each other at family events and the closeness of their relationships. They had a new understanding of what family really meant, the kind that went beyond money, and they loved it more than anything else.